What's up everyone, it's Masenko here, and I'm bringing you a video today concerning tier lists. There's been a lot of discussion within the VDL Discord concerning tier lists for the next season, so I wanted to make this video. I was encouraged to make this video by Gumi, and just sort of give general thoughts about tiering in general, like sort of different ways to think about it. And then I'll give my own specific recommendations. One caveat is I just want to make it clear that this is not a request video. This is not something that I'm asking the moderators to look at my specific suggestions and to implement. If they like my specific suggestions based on the reasoning I give, that would be fantastic. But I am not really looking for substantive change. I'm just really looking to further the discussion and sort of consolidate my thoughts into one video. Main topics I want to cover is just like a general understanding of how tier lists work, what goes into them, why we use them, maybe some questions we have about them. The next topic would be, assuming certain things about the tier list, what approaches can we do to fill it out? And the third topic is what factors matter when making those placements. How do we think about where a certain Pokemon should go within the tier list? What are the different ways to look at it? And then finally, I'll get into my specific recommendations. Let's move on to the first topic of how do tier lists work? Why do we even use tier lists in the way that we do? Are we saying that by dividing the Pokemon up, there's objectively better Pokemon than others? Or do we have sort of a subjective understanding of Pokemon that guides our intuition about this? So let's tackle that first question and sort of think about that for a second. Is like, what is an alternative to a tier list in Pokemon, let's say? And I like the last question in relation to this one as well. It's just like, how many tiers can we possibly do? Because technically, you could tier each Pokemon alone in their own tier and just have a list of Pokemon in the order of how good they are. So why don't we do that? And why do we draw the lines that we do? I think the easiest answer to this is efficiency. It is a very difficult task to really just like sit down and outline all the Pokemon and just like create a list that people will agree on of what's better than other things. And the fact that there are so many different dimensions upon which a Pokemon can be good at something can kind of become a bit of an apples to oranges situation where you can't really compare, like for instance, Indeedee female to let's say like a Metagross, right? Both of them serve a very strong purpose, and both of them are tier 1s, but they just serve such different purposes. Even though they're both psychic types, you can really, it's really hard to compare them. So how do they find themselves in the same tier? I think part of it is efficiency. If something's the best at what they're doing, you can kind of group them together. The other aspect of it, I think, is that gets kind of fun is the gamification of it. The tier list can be a bit of a game, and you can, go into a certain tier, and the fact that we divide it, rigidly between certain tiers, there's going to be Mons who are kind of on the borderline, right? And one of the games that you're kind of playing in a draft league is, can I snag those Mons who are either on that borderline, like a really high value tier pick, or even Mons that maybe belong in a higher tier, and they were just mistiered for this season or whatever, and I can just grab that and make a lot of use out of it. I think that's a really fun sort of thought process to have, and feels rewarding at times, which I think is being facilitated by how we do tier lists. Now, I can't answer the question of why we do 5 tiers or 4 tiers. A lot of leagues do. It's kind of been the practice. So, I don't have really a conclusion on that one. It's just sort of an interesting observation. It's like, why do we do it this way? Some approaches that exist when it comes to tiering the mons. Some approaches are considering the seasonal shifts. So like maybe we're doing a different format in a certain season, and we're transitioning to something different. I mean, Dynamax versus no Dynamax is a very, very different type of game. So it's important to, keep that in mind when you're approaching tiering and thinking about which mons thrive better in a Dynamax environment versus mons that thrive better without Dynamax. One thing to worry about a little bit sometimes when it comes to season to season changes is sometimes one mon or one tier might have some issues or feel under or overpowered. In this, season, we're talking a lot about how tier 4 felt underpowered. There felt like the mons in it just weren't worth the points you were paying for them. And so there's been discussion of, moving up some mons from tier 5, moving down a couple mons, maybe from tier 3, just to kind of flesh it out a little bit more, give it a little bit more roundedness. The question that everybody should be asking who wants that, and I also think that's a good solution to what happened, but we should always be wary of overcorrecting and causing problems elsewhere. Kind of thinking about, okay, well, how is this going to affect tier 5 in the next season? And do we feel like we're getting rid of any of the sort of like value tier 5 picks? Something to just think about for sure. The next sort of tool list that we can use be democratic about it. I think this is sometimes effective because a lot of people have their own subjective experiences on whether a mon is good or bad, and if you just sort of aggregate all of that, all of those subjective perspectives, you approximate probably a good spot for that mon. And there's also data-driven sort of analysis you could do where you can sort of like track the stats of a Pokemon across various leagues and see how well it's doing. But, obviously not all leagues use the same tier list. Not all leagues use the same format. So that can be sometimes kind of difficult to get. Prior performance, again, like, looking to last season, something like for example, Heatmore did really well last season, and I think Goomer is right to caution us to move it up a tier because I think prior performance can be sometimes misleading. But if the same sort of performance is happening season by season, that could be an indicator that Pokemon might be stronger than people give it credit for. And then there's also sort of like an intuitive question that I ask myself a lot of times is like, is there ever a situation where I want to pick this Pokemon for this amount of points? In other words, sort of like a cost-benefit analysis. So I'll look at a Pokemon in a specific tier and I go, would I purchase this Pokemon on any team for this amount? And if the answer is yes, then the next question I ask myself is, how much value am I getting out of it? If it's too much value, maybe it deserves a higher tier. If the answer is no, I tend to think that maybe this mon is tiered incorrectly. And then I go to the next tier and I say, okay, well, is this, in a lower tier, is this mon worth the points now? And if so, maybe I've found a good middle ground. If it's still unclear, maybe they're a borderline mon. And then another sort of like philosophical side of this is whether we think that an individual Pokemon has a static or a variable power level. And what I mean by this is if you take a Pokemon and put it into a meta, do those Pokemon have static sort of power levels within the sphere of Draft League? Or does a Pokemon's power depend on something else? For instance, what was drafted? There might be a season where certain Mons go undrafted for teams, or some teams are pursuing different strategies than last season, or maybe you have a good schedule and your Mon does better into the people. Do we measure that and account for that when we talk about the tier list, or do we just try to assign a sort of permanent value to a Mon? Yeah, and then how do we sort of decide quote unquote tiebreakers? In other words, if a Mon is kind of on the borderline of a tier, how do we say whether or not to put it in the higher or the lower tier? Some people will say, err on the side of caution. Don't put this Mon into a lower tier and risk the potential for somebody to get higher value than that Pokemon is worth. Or another way to do it is to say, let's just put it in that lower tier and see what happens, and see if people actually value it more because it's a lower tier, or maybe it's less less popular anyway. Some factors I like to look at when looking at Pokemon, and just in the context of Draft League, is I like to look first at sort of its strength in a vacuum. What are its individual stats? What is its moveset? What is its abilities? Its typing? Then I look at the factors like strength in a team context. What does it provide to a team? There's also the sort of discussion in this sense about soft synergy versus hard synergy. You could have a pretty, bad typing, but if you pair it with another Mon who can kind of complement it in a lot of ways and make a safe switch in for that Mon, or do other things like that, that's going to be really good. Another thing is what kind of infrastructure that Pokemon builds for your team. Then you have to kind of look at maybe its strategic niche. Using thinking about other Mons within the same sort of role that it's playing, and comparing it to them and thinking, okay, how does it fare against this sort of would I rather pick this one or that one to fulfill that strategic niche? So for instance, you want an Intimidator and you want to compare Incineroar and Quillfish. In that strategic niche of having Intimidate, you probably want Incineroar, because it is just generally more competitive than the Quillfish, and so maybe you want to tier them in that way. Past performance, again, we really don't have a whole lot of data. If we did have more data, you could probably look to past performance to help factor in how to tier that Mon in the future, but right now it's not really worth getting into that. So where am I starting when kind of thinking about the recommendations that I'm going to make for the tier list changes? Obviously we have a 5-tier list. We're going to assume that some Mons are better than others, that the tier 1s are going to represent the best of the best Mons, and that the tier 5s are going to be sort of the worst of the worst Mons. And then I want to try to sort of assign some standards to each tier, and sort of a framework of thinking about what kind of Pokemon should go into that tier and why. So that's something that I'll define as I go. And then in terms of my sort of philosophical, my personal philosophical considerations, I do think that Pokemon are very, how good a Pokemon is can be very contextual. What do I mean by this? we were talking about Ferrothorn a bit, right? And like, I think that Ferrothorn is one of those mons that kind of sits on the very, very edge of tier 1 and tier 2. But right now it's in tier 1. And so, how good is Ferrothorn really compared to those mons? Well, one might say that it is, objectively a tier 1, but not, a tier 1 that clearly people particularly want compared to other tier 1s. And that there's a risk you run by putting it into tier 2 that it'll just, overpower, or it'll be a power boost that somebody gets for their team, and then they also get a tier 1. And because of that, the overall power level of the game has gone up. I tend to think that this is, sometimes true, maybe 50% of the time, probably. But I also think it's very true that there are going to be opportunities that people have where even in tier 2, maybe they're not picking Ferrothorn as much because of the context of how they're drafting their team. Maybe Ferrothorn is just a harder Pokemon to pick, and we won't really know that until we give it a shot in a different tier. That said, I will mostly err on the side of caution for my picks here. I think VDL is a pretty well established league, and y'all do things a certain way. And again, this is not me coming in here and trying to, bash the tier lists and bash how y'all do things. So in general, I'll probably say which ones I think are almost objectively should be in a different tier for various reasons. But I'll also sort of touch on which ones were kind of like on my mind as well. So let's jump into talking about tier 1 recommendations that I have, and how I kind of start out by looking at tier 1 and like what comes to mind, right? As I said a little bit earlier, I think tier 1 obviously houses the best Pokemon. And I think there are some sort of qualities that the best Pokemon have that can be kind of loosely defined within a couple broad categories. The first of these categories is what I like to call the unilateral threats. In other words, the Mon itself is strong enough in its own regard that it really doesn't need a whole lot to enable it in order for it to still be effective. High splashability and high consistency is a staple of a Mon like this. It really doesn't have to rely on, like I said, the enabling, the infrastructure. And most of the time it doesn't really have like a super hard counter that just like completely takes it out of the game. These are going to be like some pretty meta picks overall. And yeah, I mean, that's the first category. Second category, I like to call it the flexible build-arounds. And these are mons that tend to be a bit supportive in nature. But really, what they're all about is creating an archetype for your draft team. It's a mon that really sets the groundwork for you, creating some like game defining infrastructure. When you send out this mon, it is going to change the rules of the game in some way. Some pretty obvious examples of this include like weather and terrain. Those types of things create a dynamic within the game that other mons can use as hard synergy. So, but these mons in particular aren't just, there to do the one thing, the one sort of job that they have of setting the infrastructure. They can tend to also have other optionality. And we'll talk about some mons that I think fit within this category. But This is to contrast with a later category for a different tier, which is a little bit more inflexible, that these mons create infrastructure but don't really have much other options other than fulfilling the job that they're assigned. And the final category is sort of birthed out of a hesitation to allow these mons to wander into lower tiers. I like to call them niche but powerful. These are mons that have clear weaknesses. They're not really unilateral threats in the sense that they have high splashability per se. But the issue is that when they do work, they're so oppressive that it is a little bit scary to put them in a lower tier. We'll talk about some examples of this in just a minute. So some unilateral threats are listed here. I'll probably touch only on a couple of them. But like, you look at a mon like, Incineroar right there in the second row. It's incredibly splashable, has a lot of, potential for support options with Intimidate and Fake Out, but it also has, Flare Blitz, Darkest Lariat, which is very good physical offense at times. You look at a mon like Garchomp even, who, might have that 4 times ice weakness, but I found that it's actually a little bit harder than expected to even kill it with ice moves before it can KO something. So basically, you see any of these mons on your opponent's team, and you have to start thinking immediately, just by the fact that it exists. How do I beat this thing? So yeah, so that's what the point of being unilateral threat is. They're definitely all just difficult to just slap a move onto a Pokemon or pick a Pokemon that really counters them. And they're just going to be good in most teams overall. Some flexible build-arounds. Again, these are mons that really provide a lot of strong infrastructure. You'll notice that there are good terrain setters, such as Lele and Indeedee. You'll see that there are some really good prankster users, Grimmsnarl, Whimsicott, the Genies. Some really good follow me support in the form of Togekiss, the Clefable, and Clefairy, again, Indeedee. And then even like Regieleki, I tend to think is a very great build-around mon because of its the way it changes the game, right? We're talking a little bit about how these mons are changing the rules a bit. The fact that Regieleki has like 200 speed is the reason it is a build-around mon, in the sense that it's going to really change the rules on the opponent. It's like really difficult to match that level of speed. So they have to really respond to its existence in that regard. But if you notice that all these mons listed, they all have a lot of flexibility as well. They don't have to create that infrastructure. They can make use of other infrastructure to succeed as well. And then at the bottom row there, you'll see some niche but powerful picks I thought worth mentioning. These are mons, again, that, I'm a little hesitant to suggest moving down a tier, despite the fact that they're not really, unilateral threats per se. I think Urshifu can definitely fit into the unilateral threat category, but I do think that it is a little bit more restricted and a little bit less splashable than some of the mons listed in that category before. You just kind of don't want to let something like a Kartana get into a lower tier. In my opinion, it's just a little bit too... its snowball potential is really strong if you can kind of play around its weaknesses, which are very, clear weaknesses. And then, of course, like Amoonguss, why is he in this sort of category? I mean, it's a semi-bulky mon. I actually don't think Amoonguss is like too strong, except for the fact that it has Spore, and just being able to Spore stuff for a cheaper sort of slot with a mon that doesn't, isn't like Fungus or the Morlul line, that in general is going to be a little bit easier to deal with. I mean, Amoonguss is not super OP, but it does require a little bit more in terms of investment to try to kill it. And if it's just going to start sporing you, it's going to be very frustrating. And I think it's a bit of like I said, this tier can be pretty oppressive. It's going to make the opponent, rage quit if the mons start popping off. So moving on to my actual suggestions for changes, we're going to go down to the tier 2 real quick, because we did talk a little bit about what the standards are. So I figured if there are any mons in tier 2 that meet those standards, then it's worth looking at them. And I have 5 upgrade recommendations from tier 2, and then I also have a small list of Pokemon on what I call a watch list, which is I didn't think they were quite tier 1, or at least I was not as convinced as I would have liked to be to make an official recommendation about them, but I think it's still worth looking and discussing the type of mons they are and what they're bringing. But let's talk about first again the official recommendations, which some of these might surprise you. Maybe they are mons you didn't think about, and you are like, oh, now I see that you recommend that. I can agree with that. Maybe. Curious what y'all think about them. First, and one that is a little less obvious, I think, is Politoed. I think Politoed definitely falls within the sort of infrastructure creation area, but I also think in a lot of ways it kind of is its own sort of unilateral threat. It's a bulky Watermon, as we know that most draft teams want to secure, I think. Being able to set rain allows it to boost its own offensive pressure. And overall, like as we've seen, and this wasn't just last season, but I think most of the seasons that I've seen Politoed used, it's had a level of consistency that I think we can all agree is befitting of a mon in draft league that you generally want to grab. So I think in a lot of ways, Politoed kind of meets this criteria of being a tier 1 mon that I've set out. It kind of falls a little bit within the infrastructure and within the category of being a flexible build around mon. We can talk about, I think, Raikou and Suicune kind of in the same line. They obviously do different things, but I think moving them both up a tier is appropriate. I mean, there have already been talks of Suicune moving up a tier. It's just such a good, consistent mon. Once again, a unilateral threat in its own right. Just being so bulky, getting Snarl, getting the ability to burn with Scald, getting Tailwind to enable your team a little bit. In that sense, it provides a little bit of infrastructure itself. And I think definitely provides a lot of value to the team and is incredibly splashable. Another, obviously, bulky water type. And then Raikou kind of plays a similar role. He's this kind of like bulky electric type. He has like Snarl, he can Calm Mind, he has good coverage overall. And I think overall, like in a non-max format, it's seems like it's been doing incredibly well. So I think the level of sort of like splashability and consistency, again, puts these in tier 1. Registeel, same deal. I like, I don't want to have to sound like a broken record. A lot of these are going to be some sort of self-evident, but, Registeel being very much a unilateral threat, I think. And Umbreon also, I think it's a pretty strong unilateral threat. If you do not have a good answer to Umbreon, it will just win games for you, for your opponent, I guess. It's just one of those mons that I think can carry a full team by itself. It doesn't really need a ton of infrastructure to succeed, and it can be very threatening for sure. On the watch list, Gigalith for sure is there. There's also, in a later slide, you'll see that Tyranitar is kind of on a watch list for mons that would be demoted potentially to tier 2. I think there's a lot of interesting discussion surrounding these two mons. I won't get too much into the weeds of it. I think Goomer made some really good points about it that I tend to agree with. So if you go watch his video, you can get more context on that. But the sort of core of it is, if you look at something like a Tyranitar or a Gigalith, there's kind of fitting into these categories. They're kind of unilateral threats. They're creating a lot of infrastructure. So definitely worth looking at. The Lotties, again, very splashable. Unilateral threats. Create a lot of infrastructure with Tailwind, Icy Wind, some other stuff. Ninetales might be a little bit controversial. It's definitely not as, I would say, survivable and splashable as, say, like a Politoed. But then again, it does have a lot of really good utility. Could definitely go within a build around sort of category, building around a Ninetales instead of a Torkoal. Definitely worth thinking about. Thundurus also stuck out to me. This mon, again, very splashable. Tons of consistent damage. Not a whole lot of weaknesses to worry about. You can run it super bulky. And yeah, I mean, you can also create a lot of infrastructure for your team in the sense that I believe it gets Electro Web and whatnot. Indeedee Male is a very interesting mon that I wanted to raise because, frankly, in my opinion, I think that if Indeedee Female was not a thing, like if it just didn't exist, that Indeedee Male would probably be tier 1. But the sheer fact that Indeedee Female exists means that sort of like point of comparison, I think, pushes the Indeedee Male down a little bit. I think Indeedee Male, again, creates a lot of infrastructure. It's like a pretty solid mon at the end of the day, and can be pretty splashable as well. So my sort of thoughts behind it was, I don't necessarily think it's I'm not arguing that it's a tier 1 mon, but I'm curious what y'all think about that, that sort of idea of like, if Indeedee Female didn't exist, where would this be? Would this be a tier 1 mon? And half of me says yes, and half of me says no. So thought I'd mention it. Now, the last two, like Bronzong and Hitmontop, I was a little hesitant to put on here because I think people are gonna, send some weird looks at the camera and be like, okay, what is Masenko smoking? But like just looking at them, I think, one by one, starting with Bronzong, I think he has a level of consistency and survivability that you would look for in a tier 1 mon. It's not very easy to kill, doesn't have a ton of hard counters, right? I'd say it's very, very splashable. I mean, this is a steel type that can mitigate its own weaknesses in various ways, can create a lot of infrastructure in the terms of Trick Room. It can be an offensive threat with Iron Defense Body Press. I think it's honestly quite comparable to like a Cresselia in a lot of ways, just a little bit different in the sense that Cresselia has a lot more sustain, but I do think this, Bronzong can be useful in ways that Cresselia isn't as well. Now, to say whether he is tier 1 or tier 2 is a good question. I'm almost thinking it's probably. I would maybe even still pick it if it were in tier 1. I'd have to think about it a little bit, but maybe I would. I'm curious what y'all think. Him on top follows the same sort of logic. It's just this level of consistency, intimidate, fake out. Has a lot of really good priority moves in the form of Mach Punch, Bullet Punch, Sucker Punch. You can also, slap on a Technician instead of Intimidate in certain matchups. So, in other words, it's a Mon that creates a lot of infrastructure for your team. A really decent build around Mon, very splashable, etc., etc. So definitely worth thinking about if we're going to use the standards that I've sort of laid out for tier 1. Moving on to tier 2. Again, some categories to look at within the tier are going to be, I call it stonks. It's basically just the idea that this Mon is going to need some investment. In other words, it's going to need some infrastructure. You're going to need to pick some other Mon to help enable it, probably. But if it does, pop off, it's going to have a really high impact on the game. And it's probably not too hard to get it to that point. Probably has about as much impact as like a tier 1, right? The second category is the sort of jack of all trades. This is a category of Mons that do a lot of different things pretty well, and also, can find really good situations to thrive, but they might not be as effective as the tier 1s that might do the same thing. And then, like I mentioned, there's the inflexible build-arounds, as opposed to Mons like Indeedee, who, yes, it provides the infrastructure, but then after that, it has so many things that you could do with it. You can try to go a little bit more offensive with it. You can be entirely supportive, helping hand set with Follow Me. But these Mons, on the other hand, have their sort of jobs that they do, and they do it well. But they're not as flexible as say, like an Indeedee. In order to make them do something creative outside of their sort of assigned role, it would take a lot of work to do that. So now that we've sort of discussed the standards that I want to apply to tier 2, let's talk a little bit about which tier 1s will go down under my recommendations. I think Aegislash in particular is a Mon that can do a lot of good things, kind of a jack of all trades. It has good special coverage, good physical coverage, can be quite defensive in a lot of ways. You play some mind games with your opponent with its King's Shield move. But at the end of the day, I think part of the reason it hasn't been picked so much is because it really doesn't offer anything that another tier 1 couldn't simply do slightly better. And in that sense, another thing worth mentioning is its unique typing is both a blessing and a curse in a lot of ways. I think its unique typing is like insanely good, very, very good defensive typing. But because of its defensive typing, you really want something good to pair it with in order to make up for some of its weaknesses. You want it to be a good switch in for something or vice versa. And I think a lot of Aegislash's strengths come from being on a team with a lot of other things. And I think because of that, it really deserves to be a tier 2 over a tier 1. Because you're really not getting a ton of value out of it picking it as a tier 1. But you can get a lot of value with it being a sort of a partner of a tier 1 that provides a lot of threat in its own right, and sort of plays off that sort of carry. So for those reasons, I think it goes down a tier. Conkeldurr, I think, is a little bit more obvious, a more straightforward argument. I think this mon needs more infrastructure than any tier 1 would usually need. It is not really a unilateral threat. Of course, you do get, Guts, Mach Punch, sure. But I don't think that combo alone makes it threatening enough, especially since you do need an extra turn in order to set up the Guts, right? You need to have the burn go off. And I think in that sense, it's pretty reasonably a tier 2. Not terrible speed tier, but it has terrible speed, meaning that you kind of want it under Trick Room as a Trick Room threat. And because of that, you do need a lot of infrastructure for it. Hatterene kind of suffers a little bit similarly to Aegislash, but kind of in a different way. It is a mon that also wants to be under Trick Room, and it can set its own Trick Room, which is really, really good. But in order to make that effective, I think you do need some support for it, because Hatterene does not have the level of bulk that's needed, I think, to be a one-man Trick Room setter and threat. If you look at mons like Porygon 2, even something like a Cresselia maybe, in tier 1, they can kind of set their own Trick Room and feel fine about it, because they have the bulk to withstand those turns that are needed for that setup. And they also have the recovery needed to deal with that as well. I'm not 100% sure. I should go check to see if Hatterene does have any sort of recovery, but I do know it doesn't have the bulk that the other Trick Room setters that I was just talking about have. And so it runs into this conundrum of needing to set its own Trick Room, but also wanting to carry through its own Trick Room, and that ends up being a little bit more slow than if you have a partner mon helping it get through that. Something like, I think the classic pairing is with Indeedee Female, which provides a ton of infrastructure for it to get up its own Trick Room and then sweep from there. Also, part of the reason I think it was a little bit better in the Dynamax format is for that exact reason of it can Dynamax, meaning that it gets that bulk that it wants. Plus, its Dynamax move was kind of broken, of just straight up confusing your opponent's mons. So I think those reasons definitely play an effect. Naganadel is your classic glass cannon mon. It is very fast, has a lot of special offense. It can snowball with Beast Boost, but I also don't think it rises to the level of toxicity that some of the other mons in tier 1 likely have. I think it has it's easier to deal with in a lot of ways, I just think it's not as threatening, and because of that for that reason, I think it's not really a unilateral threat. You don't have to pay it as much respect to the Naganadel as you do some of the other mons. Not to say you don't pay it any respect. I think it is a very powerful mon, but a tier 2 mon nonetheless. Let's talk a little bit about some of the mons on my watch list. I'll try to go quick with these because this is taking more time than I expected. The first, I guess let's start with the last one, being Tyranitar. Tyranitar is a mon that I'm always surprised at how effective it is, despite its 4 times weakness. It seems difficult to exploit it for some reason. And I can't really put my finger on it, but it does seem more difficult to exploit. There has been some discussion of Tyranitar versus Gigalith, who's better, whether or not to put them in the same tier, whether to put them in tier 1 or tier 2, etc. And I won't really weigh in on that one. I just think that it's worth mentioning in these standards that Tyranitar has a 4 times weakness. It isn't like a super good speed tier, with I think 60 base speed or something similar to that. So like, it's just one of those mons that you kind of underestimate it just by virtue of its clear weaknesses. So whether that underestimation is warranted or not is a different question, and therefore deserves to be kind of on the watch list. I think it's a Pokemon worth exploring more. Regidrago, I think can move down a tier for sure. Main reason I didn't recommend it is I'm worried because I don't have the sort of experience with this Pokemon, that it kind of maybe falls into the niche but powerful category where you might not want people to get it for cheaper because of its damage output, and can be kind of oppressive in that sense. But I'm not 100% sure that it rises to the level of the other ones. It is an awkward speed tier. It is weak in a lot of ways to fairy mons, not just because it takes more damage from them, but you want to make use of your Dragon's Maw ability, which is going to boost your dragon type attacks, and then you want to do the Dragon's Rage, or I don't remember what it's called, the water spout, but dragon type. And when there are fairies on the field, they're just immune to all of that. So I think there are some pretty obvious counters to this mon. It's a little bit too narrowly defined in what it can do. So I think it's worth looking at moving it down for those reasons. Milotic, I'm less sold on moving it down, but I do think there is an argument for it, especially if Suicune stays in tier 2, which I don't think it will. I think those mons are kind of analogous. The Milotic has a little bit of infrastructure it provides, and it's not a super obvious, like hard infrastructure, but the fact that it gets competitive really disincentivizes bringing Intimidate against your team, which can create more space for your physical threats, right? And that's what I mean a lot of times when I'm talking about infrastructure. It's like creating space and creating opportunities that otherwise wouldn't be there. Milotic definitely provides this, and it's also an insanely bulky mon. You can also run it with Marvel Scale and like Flame Orb and Recover, and like against physical teams, it's just going to destroy them. They can't break this mon even if they, no matter how hard they try. It's kind of ridiculous. So in a lot of ways, I do think it's also kind of a unilateral threat. But I also think that Milotic can have a bit of all my friends are dead syndrome. And for that reason, I think if we're talking about keeping like Suicune in the other tier, Milotic is a mon that you want to look at as well, because I don't think that Milotic is necessarily better than Suicune. Landorus Incarnate is a mon that I think is just kind of strictly worse than its counterpart, just by virtue of the fact that Landorus T gets Intimidate. Now, that might be a sort of generalization. Obviously, there are going to be specific instances where one is better than the other for whatever reason. But I will say, just on the average, I think that Landorus T, because of Intimidate, is a lot more splashable than Landorus I. With an Intimidate mon, with like U-turn, you could like do some Scarf U-turn shenanigans with Intimidate, and I think that's like super effective. As opposed to the Sheer Force set that you want to bring on Landorus I, which I think needs more infrastructure for sure. And And so for those reasons, I think that Landorus T is just a little bit more flexible, a little bit more splashable, whereas Landorus I kind of has a more defined set of things it wants to do. And it definitely, I think, needs a little bit of protection because of that 4 times weakness that at least Landorus T can mitigate to somewhat with the Intimidate. Gothitelle, I think, falls into a similar boat as Hatterene, though I will say it does create more infrastructure than Hatterene. Gets that competitive, like I was talking about with Milotic, which obviously creates some space for your physical mons. It has Fake Out, which is really nice. It has Shadow Tag, which can be really devastating if you pair it with like a Perish Song user. It creates infrastructure for some unique strategies in that way. But overall, I do think it's not really the best at what it does. I think there are other options that can get you to enable mons in more better ways. But I think it's another mon that I think is kind of like not as picked as often and has some issues in terms of like what it brings to the table. It's a really good mon, but it kind of just falls short, and I think it falls on that borderline, which is kind of why I want to mention it. Ferrothorn is a mon that I think falls into the niche but powerful category, otherwise in tier 1. But the fact that it is slow, the fact that it is 30 speed or less, actually, I don't remember the exact speed, it might be 20 or something like that. I think the fact that it's so slow and it has that 4 times weakness, you're really looking to create infrastructure with it. It is a risky mon otherwise. The question is how easy it is to create that infrastructure in order for it to succeed. And the potential snowball effect that Ferrothorn can have against somebody, how oppressive it is. The obvious like counterpart that you look to in like tier 1 would be like a Kartana, just because of the same typing. How easy is it to deal with Kartana? It varies, based on your fire coverage that you drafted. But I think Ferrothorn is going to, whatever Kartana has in terms of issues, can be at least made up by the fact that it can trade effectively. It can pick up kills in the same vein as being killed. That's not as guaranteed with Ferrothorn. Ferrothorn can obviously do Iron Defense Body Press stuff. It can do some really threatening stuff, but it does need a little bit of setup, right? It needs a little bit of infrastructure to get there. Excadrill, I think, also is kind of a stonks Pokemon. It's always in tier 1, and I never kind of know exactly why it's in tier 1. And I think that just comes down to lack of experience. But I do say, I think this is a Pokemon that does want a Sand Setter, obviously. And can obviously do some pretty insane damage with its moves and its abilities. So, it's just like, it's good. It's a question of like, do we really want this to be in tier 1? Like, I'm not sure, which is why I'm putting it on the watch list, because I am not sure. I don't really know why it would be in tier 1 versus tier 2 or otherwise, and maybe somebody can enlighten me to that. Dragonite is a mon that I think Goomer rightfully talked about as being a really good tier 1 as well. It was in consideration, which is why I put it on the watch list for sure. It does get that 4 times weakness. But unlike, Landorus I, it gets multi-scale, which is going to kind of at least mitigate it for the first hit. And it automatically creates some room for itself in that to get off a Dragon Dance, to, do whatever it wants to do. It also has some really good enabling tools like Aqua Jet. It gets extreme speed, which is pretty interesting. So it has some speed options. But, why is it on the watch list? Well, when you apply the standards, you kind of think that this mon maybe needs a little bit of setup, maybe a little bit of help doesn't quite have that unilateral threat status that others do, or maybe it does. It's kind of a debate, I think, that I'm going back and forth on. So let's go into the actual tier 2s that currently are in that tier. Here's just sort of a list of mons that I consider to have these stonks quality, needs some infrastructure, needs some investment, but once it does, it can just really go to town. Yeah, I won't dwell on that too long. If you have any sort of questions about why certain mons are on here or not, then feel free to ask me. Some jack of all trades mons are mons that I think can do a lot of things well, again, but nothing's, to the level of a tier 1, really, or they have sort of middling, or not middling, but like a nice distribution of stats, like a Gudra, who obviously has that really high special defense and can kind of carry itself with its own stats to some degree. Gastrodon, obviously, another one. It's not really like a threat in like the way that it's gonna kill you, but it can be really threatening just by its virtue of having the storm drain and the bulk and whatnot. Moving on. These are the inflexible build-arounds that I was mentioning before. These are mons, again, that they basically do a job really well, and not much else. Like, there's not a ton of flexibility with them. I think mons that kind of become somewhat exceptions to this sometimes are like Raichu, maybe Mandibuzz, maybe like Weavile sometimes. But I'd say the rest of them are pretty consistently doing something to enable others. You might also say, maybe Ninetales would not be super falling into this category, but I do think that unlike the other weather setters, what it's setting up for others isn't as powerful. Like Sand and Sun and Rain are all much more abusable than Hail. But I do think Ninetales is definitely the best out of these and does it well and does its job well. But not a ton else. Some recommendations from tier 3 that I think deserve to be in tier 2. The first one is Barraskewda. I think Barraskewda is a very powerful mon that I think some people kind of underrate. It is insanely fast, ignores redirection, and is a physically offensive water type, which fulfills a niche that isn't really used all that often, but can be really interesting on certain teams for sure, especially teams that really don't need a bulky water type to succeed. But like I said, you do kind of need the right team for it. And compared to the standards that I've sort of set out for tier 3, I think that Barraskewda in a lot of ways fulfills the stonks category. You can really make this mon shine on the right team. Duraludon is sort of similar, I think. I think it is a mon that fulfills a unique sort of special steel type category, and is very effective at that if you can give it the correct infrastructure, again. I know I sound like a bit of a broken record in that sense, but that's kind of what the tier 2 is all about, is this infrastructure. Dusknoir, I think, is super duper consistent. I'd say it's kind of a jack of all trades mon. It sets Trick Room, very bulky, has some good offensive pressure, but really isn't the best at any of these when compared to some other tier 1s. The Pelipper, I think, is a enabler for sure. I don't know if it's flexible or inflexible. I know, it gets Tailwind. It can set its own rain for like hurricanes and boosting its water type stab. But like, at the end of the day, it does have that 4 times weakness. So when you are building a rain team around Pelipper, you do definitely need to account for that. It's not just as splashable as something like a Politoed. And again, I don't think it fits into the sort of like tier 3 standards that we'll talk about in just a moment. Vikavolt is very similar. I mean, this Mon is not only pretty bulky, it gets like an insane special attack stat. And really all you got to do to make it succeed, I think, is to set Trick Room for it. So Vikavolt is definitely like a really just solid Mon, very high value threat, but just needs that sort of Trick Room or infrastructure. I think Escavalier in this upgrade watch list kind of fulfills that same sort of threatening Trick Room bug type that Vikavolt does, but just for the physical side. But it really needs that infrastructure again, and I do think that maybe because of that 4 times fire weakness, you do run into some problems where maybe it just needs a little bit too much infrastructure to succeed, which would make it not as stonks as some of the others. So kind of on the watch list for that reason. Gengar is kind of a glass cannon in a lot of ways. Very fast, does a lot of damage. But whether or not it is sticking to the criteria of a tier 3, or if it sort of fits within the sort of the stonks category, where if you can give it a little bit of redirection, it can be this really offensive threat, is another question. Inteleon, I do think has a lot going for it as well. Similar to Gengar in a lot of ways, just very fast. Has some decent burst damage in the form of Snipe Shot. You can do some really interesting things. Get speed control with Icy Winds and whatnot. So I do think it can kind of be a jack of all trades, for sure. Jellicent, I mean, it's just so bulky with all that HP. It can set Trick Room. It does pretty well in that sense. Ghost Water is a very interesting typing that I think is very defensive. And so I think it kind of can fit into a jack of all trades style as well. Masharna, I think, follows a similar line as the Jellicent. Ribombee, and I'll talk about Salazzle as well. I think, well, actually, no, let's talk about Ribombee first. Ribombee, I think, kind of fits into the inflexible build-around Mons. I think that, like, I've used Ribombee several times, and it is just so frail that in order for it to be effective, like if you want it to do something more than what its sort of natural skill set is, it does need like a lot to go right for it. But otherwise, I mean, it's just a really good speed swap Mon. Can't be faked out. You speed swap a huge amount of speed onto something, and then you kind of support from there. Really good on Trick Room teams. But otherwise, you know, very effective at what it does, maybe not as effective in other areas. Might be worth putting it in that tier. Salazzle's kind of almost a weird jack of all trades Mon, in the sense that it has nice fast fake out, some pretty good some pretty good supportive tools, but what really kind of makes it stand out, it's kind of like a Mienshao in a lot of ways, a special Mienshao, where it's basically going to fake out, set the stage, you know, and then it's going to try to pick up like a KO somewhere with like an overheat. And because of that, it's just like, it might kind of fit within the same category as Mienshao, I would say. Might be in the inflexible build around type category, but it also might just be a little worse. Might be one of the categories you'll see soon is sort of like budget options. Might be more of a budget option. I tend to disagree. I think Salazzle is actually really good. Whether or not it should be in tier 2, though, is a different story when you have stuff in there like Kangaskhan and Mian Xiao. Swampert. There was some discussion about Swampert. That's why I put it here. I really don't think Swampert is super convincingly a tier 2. It can be sort of a jack of all trades, but the issue is obviously that 4 times weakness. It is not bringing a ton to the table in terms of infrastructure, other than being a water type immune to electric, which can be very helpful. As we discussed before, Pelipper likes certain mons on its team. Something like a Swampert's pretty good, but obviously you might want like a Seismitoad instead to make use of Swift Swim. I do think it can go into tier 2 for sure. It's like a very strong, consistent mon, but it is certainly doesn't excel in any particular area better than other counterparts of it, and it does have that 4 times weakness. Weezing, the other Weezing is already in tier 2, the Weezing Galar. I think definitely the fact that the other form gets misty terrain and stuff like that definitely puts it up there into sort of a jack of all trades style. It can kind of do a lot of different things as this bulky poison support. Weezing, on the other hand, the base form is maybe not as flexible, but I think the fact that it's a pure poison type really is a benefit in a lot of ways, and the fact that you just kind of want to run Levitate on it most of the time anyway, which mitigates its own weakness there, becoming only weak to Psychic. I think this mon provides a level of consistency that you might see out of a jack of all trades type mon, but that is a debate that I think is worth having without being too general about it. So let's move on to tier 3. The standards I've set for tier 3, how I imagine it is, this is the sort of like obviously middle tier, so this should house some more of the average mons. You aren't going to get too much bang for your buck from these mons, but you will, at least get something out of them that you want from them. And if you pick smartly from these mons, you can really make use of them. And if you build your team in a certain way, they can definitely thrive better than your average mon. So budget options. I do think that this definitely could have been split up into more different categories for sure. I think budget options is a very broad category, and you'll see that the slide has a lot of mons on it who fit this sort of category, in my opinion. It's something that does one or two things well, but doesn't have the same level of flexibility as the mon that you really want for it. So, I'll point out some mons who kind of fit this as well. Then there's sort of like the high maintenance mons. These are mons that have the same level of sort of power that maybe a tier 2 or a tier 1 has, but they need very specific tools in order to get there. And what I mean by specific tools is that I mean like actually like 1 or 2 mons that exist in the game that can enable them, right? I think those mons tend to be worth tier 3 just because you do have to invest into specific other combos with it, and therefore you're kind of limiting your options in some ways when picking these mons. So now that we've looked at the tier 3 standards, some recommendations I have for dropping from tier 2 into tier 3. The first of these is Aromatisse. Now, I think Aromatisse is definitely up there in terms of a mon that's definitely draftable. It has an excellent ability, and I think that's the main thing it has going for it. It's got decent bulk. but often isn't quite getting to the level of bulk you really want to survive a lot of the big threats within the meta that it needs to deal with. And as far as Trick Room setters go, I think there are just better options. And so, in other words, Aromatisse kind of seems to me like a bit of a budget pick and should be tiered accordingly. The next two, Driftblim and Halucha, I think are kind of in the same boat as well, in terms of wanting to be dropped, not because they have similar traits to Aromatisse. But, these are both unburdened mons, right? And in particular, these mons generally want to make use of terrain, for instance. There's not a whole lot of easy ways to proc your unburden passive otherwise. So it feels like that in order to make them work, in order to make them good, you definitely want you want a decent amount of infrastructure for them to begin with. And especially a mon like Driftblim, even when Driftblim pops off, like it gets the defensive boost from a terrain seed. It's really being more supportive in a lot of ways. You get like really fast tailwinds off. You get strength sap. You get icy wind. I think some other options like weather setting and whatnot. But in order to like, if you have a mon that is mostly a support that needs infrastructure in its own sense, it seems a little high maintenance, right? It's a bit of a high maintenance pick. Halucha is very similar in that regard. Halucha does need a lot to make it really shine, and first and foremost being a terrain setter probably, or like an ice shard user to proc weakness policy. Ludicolo, I think is a decent, you can kind of qualify it as a jack of all trades, but really I do think it's at the end of the day more of a budget pick. When you're looking at Swift Swim users that can be resistant to certain types that your setters are going to be weak to, so like for instance electric, in the sense of Politoed and Pelipper are both weak to electric, Ludicolo is going to be neutral to that. I think there are definitely better Swift Swim users you can grab. Kingdra in tier 2, I think, is a really solid Swift Swim user. I think there are some others, but I think at the end of the day, Ludicolo is a bit of a budget pick when it comes to getting rain. I think Passimian is, at least in my opinion, quite underwhelming. If you're looking for a decent Defiant user, fighting type to create some space for yourself, by all means pick Passimian. But I have not found that, like, even if you can do some combo with Receiver, like maybe that's a bit of a high maintenance type pick where you want to try to pick something like even a Zoomeril or something where you're doing like Misty Explosion plus weakness policy, Receiver into huge power. Like, I don't know. That's better in Dynamax format anyway. So like, I don't know. Passimian just feels very underwhelming to me, and I think it's a solid fighting type, but not, it's no Conkeldurr, it's no Hitmontop, that's for sure. Tangrowth. So this has been a Pokemon that's been discussed a little bit in the Discord. I sort of followed along with that discussion, and I think I come to the sort of conclusion that I think Tangrowth, is a budget pick in a lot of senses. You have a lot of better redirectors in higher tiers, and I think Tangrowth tends to suffer a little bit from an identity crisis, where like I'm not 100% sure how I would want to use him and where he would thrive, other than to sort of approximate certain things such as if you really wanted a chlorophyll user, like there are better options for sure. Like Venusaur's in tier 3, for instance, like definitely a much better chlorophyll user. If you wanted a rage powder user, I would even maybe pick Tangela over Tangrowth. I would pick, Amoonguss or Volcarona or something like that. And I think Tangrowth also kind of has this weird weakness of having pretty bad special defense. And then Uxie is just kind of budget Cresselia, in my opinion. But it doesn't get like recover or anything. So I think it deserves to go down. I think all the Lake Trio should probably be in tier 3. I think that's probably the most appropriate tier for them. So moving on to the watch list, Azumarill is a mon that I think does need quite a bit of setup in order to make useful. It's the kind of mon that wants to like belly drum behind redirection and then start aquajetting stuff. Azumarill, I think, is surprisingly good in that regard, but I do think it just has pretty high maintenance cost. So I think it kind of straddles the line, right? It kind of either is a stonks mon or it is a high maintenance mon, where the output for that high maintenance, you kind of need a redirector in a lot of cases, because I don't really think it has the bulk to just like survive an attack and expect to get a belly drum off afterwards. Dracozolt is definitely also kind of straddling that line. I'm not sure whether or not I've seen a team that effectively uses Dracozolt, even teams with like really good sand setters. It's kind of underwhelming compared to a lot of the other stonks mons, but I would say it's a little bit scary to drop down to tier 3 and call it high maintenance. Gourgeist, I'm thoroughly befuddled by this mon. Like on paper, it seems fine. In practice, I've seen it just go apeshit to town. Like it just destroys things. Yeah, I don't know. It's like it can set its own trick room. It's got really good physical coverage. You got like different sizes you can bring it as. I don't know. Maybe it does deserve to be tier 2. But for me, I always look at it and I go, what's so good about this mon? I can't really tell. I don't know. That's just me. Crocodile. I think you have better intimidators overall. Crocodile has a lot of weaknesses. And I think that really shows. And switching in a Crocodile as an intimidator, a lot of the weaknesses it has as a ground type are going to be specially offensive, so like water and ice and grass. And all of those like are happy to shoot that into a switch in. So I think it's a bit of a budget intimidator in a lot of ways. There are definitely a lot better options out there that are more easy to pivot with. That said, I think Crocodile is obviously quite strong, so it could just be a matter of a jack of all trades type mon. Oranguru is weird. It's a really weird mon. I like it a lot. Can set Trick Room, has like some unique moves in the form of like Instruct. So yeah, I mean, like, I feel like part of the reason I would think about moving it down would be, it feels like a high maintenance mon. It feels like a mon you really need like a specific team to build around it in order to really make use of its unique set. And even when that unique set is being used, it's not like, it's not more powerful than something else that you would maybe be doing a little bit easier. So tier 3 is definitely a place I can imagine it. Scizor, I think is very sort of like one-dimensional in a lot of ways. It's kind of this like pivot mon that does some like really solid steel burst damage, has really good defensive typing, only issue being 4 times weakness to fire. You're sacrificing a lot of stuff to get that like sort of like burst damage that another Pokemon up above might be able to give you better. Then again, what it does very effectively, and it is kind of a scary mon to deal with at times. So I could also just see it being, you know, within the tier 2 as just a powerful sort of mon. Persian Alola, you know, gets Fake Out, it gets Snarl, it gets some really nice stuff. But I think it's just a budget pick compared to a lot of the tier 2 supports. Like, there were some really good supports up there. Lipard, for instance, you know, Sableye, Weavile, etc. And I think Persian does not really... It's like a budget version of a lot of those mons in a lot of ways. So I do think, like, part of me says drop it. The other part of me, though, recognizes that it can definitely match up to a lot of those mons. It does definitely bring something different. It is a little bit bulkier than a lot of them with its ability of Fur Coat, I think it's called, which just straight up doubles its defense. The next is Zarina. I think Zarina is like a pretty okay physical grass type mon. You don't see a ton of those. What really stands out for Zarina is its ability, Queenly Majesty. The real question is whether that ability alone puts it up with the tier 2s. It is kind of limited in what it's doing, and there are better physical grass mons in higher tiers, like Virizion, for instance, that can be doing a lot of really good work. And then finally, Sylveon. People really hype up this mon a lot. I think it's kind of underwhelming, honestly. Obviously, it gets Pixelate with like some interesting options, you know, Hyper Voice, Quick Attack to activate like Weakness Policy on some stuff. But, you know, despite fulfilling an interesting niche, I tend to think it's just kind of a fairy special attacker with okay, you know, coverage and like kind of a mediocre speed tier. So in a lot of ways, I think it's kind of a budget pick. But then again, like, I always see people drafting it and I see people really liking to run it. So I'm curious what people think about that, because maybe I'm just undervaluing it, and yeah, that's why it's in the watch list. So please forgive me for the amount of Pokemon on this slide. These are just the budget options from tier 3. Yeah, basically these mons are in general going to be doing some role, doing something, 1 or 2 things maybe even, and there's just going to be mons out there who do it better than them. You know, Lucario is kind of a budget Cobalion. You know, Torracat is kind of a budget, you know, Arcanine in a lot of ways, or even Incineroar. Literally, you know, there are some mons that are just like unevolved forms of mons in higher tiers. So, you know, in that sense, all of these are kind of budget in what they're doing. Some other high maintenance mons, you know, best one here, I think, that kind of epitomizes this category is Regigigas. It is a mon that literally needs a neutralizing gas user, or at least like a prankster plus worry seed user or something like that, like Whimsicott, which is a lot of investment, honestly. And then you kind of also need to build your team around, if you are going to pick like a Weezing with neutralizing gas, you kind of have to build your team around that as well, because you don't want to be shutting off abilities that you would need in situations where you have Weezing on the field without the Regigigas. So overall, I think it's like a pretty very high maintenance mon. Venusaur as well. Like I think Goomer was talking about Venusaur and saying how, without the chlorophyll active, it's like not nearly as threatening. I think the same goes for like Charizard, even though, solar power instead of chlorophyll. Why is alchemy on this list is a good question. I think alchemy is high maintenance in the sense that you really want to make use of its decorate ability. But in order to do that, you have to kind of account for its awkward speed tier. It's similar in the sense to what I was saying about Driftblim, where it's like, it's a mon that you need infrastructure in order for it to be a support mon. So you need support for your support. And because of that, it tends to be pretty high maintenance in order to make it work. Some upgrades from tier 4 to go into tier 3. You'll notice here that there's a lot of the weather abusers. So Arctovish, Armaldo, and Beartic. And then let's just throw in Slurpuff into that mix as a mon that is a terrain abuser. I think all of these obviously kind of fit into a sort of high maintenance area, or at least budget picks. And I think they're all very good. Like, I really don't, I was hesitant to just throw all of them up there, and at the risk of someone pointing out, oh, you're just going to put all of the, weather abusers in one tier. Like, maybe so. Maybe that's true, but I think they all kind of belong in that tier personally. I'm a little more dubious about Beartic, but I do think Beartic is like a pretty threatening mon in a lot of ways. It is a mon that can use Swift Swim as well, which I really like on an ice type. Can really fit into rain teams very nicely, since you're not, doubling up on typings there. And same with Armaldo, also gets Swift Swim, right? Like it's a rock bug type with Swift Swim. It's like gonna be pretty good. Obviously it's weak to water, which is, a little bit of a downside. And then you might also be looking at the watch list and seeing Poliwrath there. Why isn't Poliwrath going up a tier? I just honestly don't think Poliwrath has the same offensive pressure that the ones listed in the recommendations have. And because of that, I think he fits more into tier 4. But again, he's on the watch list, so it is sort of like paired there. Hippowdon obviously is like a really solid weather setter. I don't really think it's a tier 4. I think it's like a pretty solid mon. It is a budget weather setter, right? With some upsides of like in terms of typing. Morgrem, I think, is a good budget prankster mon. Super good in terms of like setting screens. Really nice Eviolite user. Yeah, I think it's worthy of a tier 3. Moving on to the watch list, there are some mons here that I just think are decent budget options overall. Two I'll talk about conjunctively are sort of like Luxray and Galvantula. I think these two kind of fit into the category of like budget electric support options. The thing about Luxray though is it's like a little bit more versatile. It gets like guts and some pretty good offensive pressure. Galvantula, the same thing going for it. It's got like Compound Eyes Thunder, which is obviously like super good. There are also mons like Orbeetle or Beheeyem here, who are like pretty okay budget Trick Room mons. They've definitely served different purposes. I don't think they're like easy to compare, obviously, but I think they kind of exist within that sort of realm, right? Especially Beheeyem, he wants to set Trick Room for himself. He wants to make use of that, sort of like a budget Hatterene, as I was kind of discussing earlier. Orbeetle gets like Iron Defense, Body Press, which is obviously super good. And I think the both of them, they can definitely fit within the category of like budget options. They provide certain tools that you're definitely looking for, and I think they can consistently use those tools with a decent enough infrastructure. But at the same time, I think they're overall a little bit weaker than you'd want out of a tier 3, stats wise first and foremost, but in other ways too, in terms of like move sets. Mr. Mime is an interesting one. I think if it is, if Mr. Mime Galar is in tier 3, I don't see why Mr. Mime couldn't be as well. I know Mr. Mime Galar has like Eviolite, definitely a lot bulkier, and has some interesting supportive options, Icy Wind, stuff like that, Freeze Dry. I think it has a better typing than Mr. Mime Galar, but yeah, at the end of the day, it's kind of a toss-up in my book. Turtonator, I think, is definitely a really strong mon. It's high maintenance in the sense that it really wants to combo. Like, it wants to hit a Shell Smash, it wants to do Iron Defense Body Press stuff, and in order for that to work, you kind of do need to create space for it. It does have that sort of weakness in sort of like special offense, but otherwise I think it's like definitely worth a tier 3 slot personally. We talked a little bit about Poliwrath. Poltegeist is also an interesting budget ghost pick. I think like it has a really high special attack, and if you have like a Sucker Punch user or something, you do like weak armor, weakness policy stuff with it, and like just absolutely blow things up. It also gets Shell Smash, so I think in a lot of ways it is definitely a sort of stonksmon. You want some investment into it. I think people are definitely, in the same way I think they're sleeping on the next mon that I'm going to talk about. I think people kind of sleep on Poltegeist for sure. I think Crawdaunt is super good. And I think it's worthy of a tier 3, honestly. It's a good budget Barraskewda in a lot of ways. Adaptability plus Choice Band Aquajet, like, it does so much good work for you. And being a dark type, you get some pretty solid dark physical coverage as well. I think Crawdaunt is like pretty solid budget pick. If you're the type of team who doesn't mind having your water type be a little bit more like offensive and frail, definitely consider moving up the Crawdaunt a tier. At the same time, it's only on the watch list though, because I think it has some very clear weaknesses, and it is a little frail, and you do need to build a team around it. So maybe it can be considered even high maintenance in tier 3. The Tentacruel, on the other hand, I always look at Tentacruel and think this is like a decent mon. It has a really good speed tier at 100, really solid special defensive stat, terrible defense, unfortunately. But like, I think workable, right? It's got clear body, so you can bulldoze to activate weakness policy on it. It's like super solid. For some reason, it just underperforms, I find. I think part of it has to do with its poison typing as well. I think it kind of makes it less viable as a bulky Watermon that you'd want it to be, and it's also not as offensive as you'd want it to be. So those are the upgraded recommendations. Let's move on to tier 4. So the way I define tier 4, so far we've had, right, tier 1 is just the best of the best mons that in their own right either create options for other mons or don't need as much framework in order to succeed. Then we move on to tier 2, where those mons are going to be high impact, but they're going to need a little bit of help, or they are good in their own right, but not to the same level of a sort of unilateral mon. Then moving to tier 3, you're going to need to work harder and harder for these mons to work. Now we're in tier 4, and we're at a point where it is difficult to make these mons work, right? We're in sort of the lower end of the mons that are viable, right? So I have some categories here. The first is it has a burdensome weakness or niche. What I mean by this is like the Mon. So I think to be clear, it is either a burdensome weakness or a burdensome niche. We'll talk about them separately. The burdensome weakness is like there's a very obvious weakness here, and the effort that it requires to cover up that weakness is more than the value you get out of the Pokemon. The burdensome niche is really like this Mon can really thrive in a very specific matchup that you're generally not going to have, right? It's going to be like a Mon that has a very specific move for and like ability for a very specific type of situation you want to be in, and unfortunately that situation is like very rare. So yeah, those are the first category. The other category is not very stonks. It's like a Mon that has a low return on investment. You need the infrastructure in the first place to make it work, and then when you invest in it, it's going to have like the output of a budget pick. And hopefully that is good enough. Like maybe you've designed your team in a way where that Mon can really thrive. Something like the Heatmore from last season comes to mind when talking about something like this. Although I do think Heatmore should stay in tier 5 personally for a couple of reasons. But in that way where the team it's built in such a way where Heatmore plays a very nice role with the very sort of limited play style that it has. And then there's the single track mind Mons. Similar to I was talking about like Scizor being kind of a single track mind, at least with that you have a threat that is pretty splashable, right? Like Scizor is a pretty splashable Mon in my opinion, and it can be very threatening in a variety of situations. The single track mind Mons are along those lines where they're really like they're pretty good at doing like one thing nicely, but have some like very clear weaknesses, and if your opponent has tools to stop them from doing that thing, then they're kind of useless otherwise. So the drop recommendations from tier 3 sort of fit all these criteria. There are like a little bit more than before, also because I wanted to make recommendations to sort of flesh out tier 4 a little bit better. So the first is Bisharp. It falls into that burdensome weakness category. Like I've used Bisharp a couple times, and frankly the 4 times weakness to fighting is pretty devastating, and it's in a weird speed tier as well. Even though it has like Defiant and Sucker Punch and all that kind of stuff, I just find it so difficult to play around at times that it just becomes like a crippling weakness. It just like it makes them unplayable in certain matchups, which is why I think it's more of a tier 4 than a tier 3. Frostlass, I think is pretty underwhelming as well. I think it's decent, but it's the type of Mon that just kind of has like low return on investment. Like the kind of stuff that you want to do with it is not all that impressive. Like I can never think of a Frostlass other than maybe like Frostlass Tauros in a max format where you can use Frost Breath to proc Anger Point. Like other than that, like Frostlass in general doesn't really do a whole lot, in my opinion, that you'd want a Ghost Ice type to do. Guzzlord, I mean, pretty obviously has a crippling weakness in 4 times Fairy, and also in the fact that it's hella slow. Lycanroc, I think is kind of fits into the single mind strategy type category. It's kind of there to be a semi-offensive rock type with a priority move. Like it doesn't really do a whole lot outside of like I have not seen a Lycanroc have like much utility. Sceptile, I would argue, is a low returns on investment Mon. It, You can obviously proc Unburden and try to go offensive with it. It has like a decent special attack stat, but at the end of the day, it's just kind of like doesn't do what you want it to do. And because of that, I think it's pretty low returns on investment. Scolipede. I know Gumi wanted some explanation on why I think this mon wants to go down a tier, or why I would argue for this mon to go down a tier. And I think it is because it is like a pretty single track mind mon. The thing that you want to do with Scolipede is kind of similar to Sharpedo, like another speed boost mon, where you're going to try to make use of that free speed advantages that you're getting every turn. But the main issue with speed boost mons in general is they first require a turn of setup if they're like a little slower. I think Scolipede has a pretty decent starting speed stat, so that's not even an issue for it really. Where it tends to suffer, in my opinion, is it is a mon that really doesn't have anything except for offensive pressure. It doubles down on like the offensive moves, and it has some good offensive moves for sure. Like one that definitely I think is cool is it gets Steel Roller. So like if you compare it with a terrain mon, it can like go to town in that sense. But you also have to keep in mind it's got a very like its typing isn't also not very offensive. Like Poison and Bug are not very offensive typings. So all in all, I think Scolipede does one thing really well, and that's to be a fast, offensive bug poison mon, and it doesn't really do much else. So to me, this is like a tier 4 mon. It doesn't have the flexibility of a budget pick. The next mon is Sigilif. This mon is weird. It has a lot of interesting utility, but I think it has a really bad typing. And I think the utility it provides is just a little bit underwhelming. It does get Tailwind, does get Trick Room, does, I think, get Imprison, gets like Skill Swap, all sorts of weird stuff. And I think, but the main issue is it's like kind of at an awkward speed tier to even make use of that, really. It is not very defensively capable. And I think it's just overall to make it work, to make it pull off combos with all its kind of wacky abilities, ends up being super underwhelming. Starmie, I also think, is a pretty underwhelming mon. It's like got decent speed and special attack, but at the end of the day, it's like kind of underwhelming. Tyrantrum is a mon that needs a good amount of infrastructure, and then it's just kind of like underwhelming compared to some of its counterparts. Again, I think it deserves to move down a tier. Others on the watch list that honestly I'm like pretty convinced could very well do it. I just didn't want to overflow it and was a little bit more cautious with who I was picking. Diggersby, I think, is like a pretty underwhelming mon overall. It has like a huge power, which is pretty cool, but you need like some speed control for it. And even when you do have that speed control, it's like a weird typing. It's like got kind of, it just feels a little underwhelming. It kind of feels like it also just kind of does one thing, which is, be a huge power attacker. So I think it falls into the that category. But I also do think that you cannot underestimate its damage output. Like if you do get it going, it very well could be a high maintenance mon instead of just sort of like a underwhelming limited returns mon. Drapion. Drapion is super underwhelming, I think, personally. It has a really good defensive typing, but the damage output always tends to be lacking, in my opinion. So even if you get it rolling, it's kind of meh. One build that I think could be okay is like a crit build with it, but again, that's like a build that you need to invest a lot into, and then sometimes it might not even work because you get that like low roll of missing the crit. The Executors are also kind of meh. I think they got 4 times weaknesses, and like when you're using them, they feel very sort of underwhelming. They're like not really doing a whole lot, in my opinion. But I do think that like you can't really underestimate their special attack damage output, and the fact that they have like pretty decent, like at least in Kanto Executor you have like chlorophyll and stuff, so that's pretty good. Heliolisk is like the weather flexmon. It can work in sand, sun, or rain, and overall it's decent. It has some really interesting tools, but it kind of falls under the category of like a support that needs support. But also like when it does its thing, it's kind of like underwhelming. Low returns on investment for that mon, in my opinion. You really need a lot to make it shine. Klinklang, very similar to like Tentacruel in a lot of ways, I think, where it's a mon that you look at it on paper and you go, okay, this is like a clear body mon that you can do some really interesting combos with, and yet it just kind of feels meh most of the time. Machamp, kind of meh, honestly. Even when you get a situation, the perfect situation where you're under Trick Room, you can use Dynamic Punch into something. It just feels like you wasted so many resources to even try to get there. Magnezone, that's definitely an interesting one that I don't feel... I feel like it straddles the tier 3, tier 4 sort of line. I think the fact that it is 4 times weak to ground, but nonetheless gets sturdy, is pretty okay. It has a really good special attacking stat, but a really awkward speed tier. And I think if you're looking for some really good electric or steel damage output, you have like such better options. And the scenario where you try to make Magnezone pop off, you only really get certain windows of opportunity there. And it just doesn't have the speed that even like something like Magneton has to make it worth picking a lot of times. So I think it's definitely worth thinking about dropping it. And then Thievul, kind of similar to Sceptile, I think, where it's an unburdened mon that you need that extra infrastructure in order to make work, and then when it does work, it is underwhelming. The only thing I will say is that unlike Sceptile, it has some really good pairings, say like Tapu Koko or even Tapu Lele, I think are like really good pairings for Thievul that it can enable really nicely. But like other than that, I don't think it's like pretty useful in the most amount of teams. So pretty like single-minded in terms of what it can do, and definitely a little underwhelming. So just to go over some of the tier 4 mons that sort of fit the categories, there's the burdensome weakness or niche. You know, the burdensome weakness is obvious for a lot of these mons being 4 times weak to a lot of stuff, or even like having a detrimental ability, kind of like Golisopod. And then there's the niche Pokemon that are you know, really need a very specific situation in order to be decent, which is I'm looking at mons like Excelgor, who when used in the right situation can be insanely good, but like that situation doesn't come up too often. Ice-Q, again, like it's got an interesting ability and you really need kind of a lot to make it work, and so when is the right time to even use that is kind of weird. Lurantis, you know, ditto, same deal. You know, you have to be very you have to find a really good situation to make it work. Not very stonks. These are mons that like do some stuff, but they just kind of have like low yields for what they're doing. I did use like Rotom Fan last season. I thought it was like a pretty decent mon, but like even after nasty plotting, like I still couldn't KO certain things. And I think that just like the fact that it didn't get like a stronger move like the other Rotoms, like Overheat or Hydro Pump, like tends to keep it down a little bit. So a little underwhelming. The evolutions, Flareon, Leafeon, Vaporeon, Glaceon are all on here as well. I think I tend to find them pretty underwhelming, even in situations where they could be decent. I find that they tend to be a little bit not so good. Single track Mind Mons. These are Mons that like kind of do one thing. Chansey, Blissey, like these Mons are just kind of not only cancerous, but like they kind of just sit there. They're not really doing a whole lot. Cinccino has some interesting utility, but really like the value you get out of it is the skill link set that you use. I'm not even sure what Galarian Cursola does other than being a sort of tanky wall. You have like semi-supportive Mons like Fletchinder, like Cottony, like Riolu, like Togepi. All of these Mons are doing like what their evolved forms do. Well, not Riolu, but they're all doing something, and it's usually just the one thing they're doing. Then there's Mons like Stonejourner and like Toxapex, Malamar. Like it feels like their strategies are always going to be pretty consistently what they're doing. Same with Zoroark. It's just going to be this Mon that sometimes you lead to play mind games with your opponent and pump out some strong special damage. So Mons that I think deserve an upgrade. I think Altaria is very good. Avalugg, Bouffalant, Dubwool, Lopunny, Octillery, Persian, Piloswine, Wishy-Washy, Walrein, Quillfish, Rapidash, Sharpedo, Skarmory, Spiritomb, and Thwackey. All of these are just good Mons, honestly. I don't know, like they definitely have tier 5 qualities of just kind of being a little bit more niche in their usage, how you can use them. But I honestly think some of these are honestly pretty strong. Mons like Thwackey honestly could even be tier 3, honestly, in my opinion, like Skarmory potentially. But, that's a conversation for another day. You generally don't want to skip tiers too often. Not much to be said about those other than I think they're kind of important to flesh out tier 4. Then you have Mons in the watch list who are like Dreadnought, Mantine, Skuntank, Purloin, and Porygon. I think all of these Mons are a little bit more underwhelming than the Mons up above. Though, that could be debatable. I think Batista definitely values Skuntank a lot. I think Mantine definitely had some really good performances last season. Or maybe just the one. I remember it being kind of pretty interesting set ran on it. Dreadnought kind of is trash, so maybe it stays in tier 5, but it also, is a Swift Swim user with a decent, attack stat, strong jaw, stuff like that. I think Purloin and Porygon are also like solid, not fully evolved Mons. Like Porygon has a lot of bulk from the Eviolite, but I also think that just like it is kind of it kind of almost reminds me of Bronzor in a lot of ways. Bronzor basically the one thing it does as a tier 5 is like set Trick Room and be kind of bulky and maybe get off a gyro ball or something and do like some chip damage. Porygon to me feels like it doesn't really fit up to the same level as like some of the Mons in the upgrade recommendations for sure. And then Purloin also like feels kind of underwhelming at times, but you can't obviously ignore Prankster and stuff. But I think in general, like as a Prankster Mon, it is a lot more limited. You can't even really run Eviolite on it. You kind of have to run Focus Sash. It's just not bulky enough, in my opinion. So yeah. So obviously I'm not going to like go over all the tier 5s because there's no real reason to talk about them other than what tier 4s I think should move down to tier 5, and there are not many. Basically everything else goes in tier 5 that wasn't already on the list. These tend to be kind of gimmicky mons as well. Stuff like Wobbuffet comes to mind. And are just generally like underwhelming. And not in a not stonks kind of way. Like just like kind of bad. Like they're just kind of bad. You have trouble making them work in general. Now, of course, getting into like philosophy of what tier 5 can be, you can make tier 5 a little bit more spicy, add some mons that are worth picking into tier 5. I think a lot of the mons that I recommended either move out or could move out are among those. But yeah, I think you would rather have a tier 4 that feels fleshed out than a tier 5 that feels fleshed out. In tier 5, you're really just looking to try to cut your losses and find a mon that might be able to work in a couple situations to your liking. So mons that I recommend we drop from tier 4 to tier 5 are Pikachu, Rotom, and Shuckle. Pikachu is okay. I think it could definitely fit into the sort of like niche tier of tier 4 where it's like you can find some very specific uses for it. But at the end of the day, it is a mon that like kinda takes a lot of your precious resources. Like you kind of want to run Focus Sash on it most of the time. You could run Light Ball on it to get some offensive pressure, but that like I mentioned is kind of gimmicky, right? It's one of those gimmicks that kind of belongs, in my opinion, in tier 5. Rotom, on the other hand, I think Rotom is decent. Like it's definitely not a bad tier 4 option as well. But I also think it's just like kind of weak, especially compared to its other forms. There are so many better types that you can use. And I think it kind of fits along the lines of like Emolga, who is also in tier 5, and I didn't recommend to move up. It just got some like okay supportive options and like an okay special attack stat that you can use. Shuckle, totally gimmicky, so tier 5 for sure. Drop watch list includes Sock and Scyther. I think Sock is kind of trash. And if Throw is in tier 5, I think Sock is similarly positioned to be in tier 5. It's just like if you want a fighting type, like don't pick Sock. I think the Sun Warriors can tell you that much. Scyther is also, I think, like I don't know what Scyther really does. Like I know that I know that M's picked it for this season and felt like it was valuable. So that's kind of why it's on the watch list. I'm not quite sure what it does, but I don't know. A bug flying type with okay stats is like not really on my radar of mons that I think are good. And I think in general that kind of maybe fits into a tier 5 situation more than some of the mons we talked about for tier 5. So that is the end of the video. Some takeaways before we finish up here. Tier lists are obviously very interesting to me, and I thank you for taking the time to watch up to this point if you have. And I think I'm still sort of like developing my sensibilities when it comes to these kinds of things as well. So, what I'm expressing here is just sort of my own ideas and experiences. So if you disagree, I really encourage you to reach out to me about this kind of stuff. And I think I definitely proposed some changes that might, get the gears turning a little bit in some people's minds and start to think about, how they really look at each tier. And whether or not like assigning standards to each tier is something that is worth doing. I certainly think my methodology here is like pretty solid overall and worth thinking about. So yeah, thank you for watching. Very much appreciate it. Did a lot of work into this, into preparing for this video and recording it. So, you know, make sure to reach out to me if you have any questions, and if you want to like the video, that'd be much appreciated. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, y'all.